I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Thrills and chills in stores. I talk with Margalit Fox, the doyenne of the dead, bringing them to life. She recently retired as an obituaries writer at the New York Times. We'll talk about her career and her latest book, Conan Doyle for the Defense, the true story of a sensational British murder, a quest for justice, and the world's most famous detective writer. Next, we'll be joined by New York Times editorial board member Vikas Bajaj. He'll explain why you can't get to work on time. My Times colleagues and I discuss the most pressing issues of the week on The Backstory, and I'll have some additional thoughts on Coda. But first, my colleague Margalit Fox, her book, Conan Doyle for the Defense, the true story of a sensational British murder, a quest for justice, and the world's most famous detective. It's just been published by Random House, reviewed last week in the New York Sunday Times Book Review. And Margalit, you've been working on this for 30 years or so, or got the idea for that. It's a murder that took place in 1909. How did you get involved in it? How did Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, get involved in it?
Well, needless to say, Sam, Conan Doyle got involved somewhat before I did. The book centers on a murder that occurred actually just as it was becoming 1909, before Christmas, 1908, in Glasgow, Scotland. A very wealthy, eccentric old lady named Marion Gilchrist was murdered, and the police, on flimsy evidence, went after a German Jewish immigrant to Glasgow named Oscar Slater, a man they wanted to run out of town anyway. And so it was a very short step from the murder to the police and Crown prosecutors framing Slater for a crime they knew he didn't commit and framing him almost to the gallows.
So in a way, it resonates with exactly what we're dealing with today in terms of immigrants.
You bet. I mean, what fascinated me from the time I first read about the Slater case as an offhand mention in an old Conan Doyle biography, and indeed I read this 30 years ago when I'd come to New York, was working at an entry-level job in book publishing, and the book I'd brought with me to read on the Atrium that day was John Dixon Carr's biography of Conan Doyle. And toward the end, almost as an afterthought, Carr says, "Oh, by the way, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle also turned real-life detective and helped exonerate a man wrongfully convicted of murder who had been incarcerated at hard labor for nearly 20 years. And I was astonished. I thought, my God, the creator of the world's most famous fictional detective actually played detective himself and righted this historic wrong. Why isn't this better known? And indeed, this case seemed over time to have slipped into a crevice in history. And 30 years ago, I was not in a position to pry it out of that crevice. I hadn't even been to journalism school yet. In 2013, when I finished my last book, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, and was casting out for what to write about next, I thought, aha, I'm a senior writer at the New York Times. I've written 2 narrative nonfiction books. At last, I'm in a position to bring the Oscar Slater story back to life.
Who was a better detective, Sherlock Holmes or Conan Doyle?
Conan Doyle always poo-pooed any comparison of his detective skills to Holmes's, but he did admit, and it's a lovely passage in his wonderful prose that I quote in the book, he says, "Yet it is true that a man cannot create a character without having some possibility of that character within him." And indeed, Conan Doyle, partly because of his training as a doctor under the brilliant medical diagnostician Joseph Bell, who was the acknowledged flesh and blood model for Sherlock Holmes, because of his training in diagnosis, in finding tiny clues in patient symptoms or later clues at a crime scene, and his experience as a writer of detective fiction, he was himself a far better rational detective than he would admit to being.
Why did he get involved in this particular case?
So in 1909, Oscar Slater, apprehended known by prosecutors and the police to be innocent, is railroaded into a trial. The trial was kind of the O.J. trial of its day. It was a sensation. The murder was in Glasgow. They had a change of venue. The trial took place in Edinburgh, widely covered by the world press. After a jury deliberated for not much more than an hour, Oscar Slater was convicted and sentenced to hang. And as strange as it sounds to us now, Scotland and then England as well had no courts of criminal appeal. So if you were sentenced to hang, you were a dead man. Slater got a remarkable reprieve literally 48 hours before he was scheduled to ascend the gallows, and he could actually hear the sound of the gallows being hammered together outside his cell. And in a detail that still gives me chills, he had made arrangements for his own burial. Imagine, that's something none of us are supposed to have to do. But there was enough public unease about the verdict. It was controversial enough that a public petition was got up that garnered 20,000 signatures, and it was sent to the only man who had the power to commute Slater's sentence, King Edward VII. And indeed, 2 days before Slater was scheduled to be executed, the king commuted his sentence to life at hard labor, and he was summarily dispatched to a place called His Majesty's Prison, Peterhead, which is a barren, windswept Victorian fortress on the raw, frigid northeast coast of Scotland. And there he languished at hard labor for 18 and a half years, breaking up granite blocks in the prison quarry. And I've been up there. It is the prison, which was in our time known as Scotland's Gulag. It was one of the worst penal institutions in Britain, operated as a prison until 2013. It had been erected first in 1888 and is now a very remarkable place called the Peterhead Prison Museum. And if one is in Scotland, well worth visiting, strange as that may sound.
Margalit, other than failing a drug test, how would Sherlock Holmes fare today as a detective?
I think he would do marvelously well because he embodied traits that, frankly, may be in short supply in public life today. Exquisite rationalism and exquisite humanism.
Interesting. Let me ask you about your prior life, if you will, as an obituary writer at the New York Times. Did you grow up wanting to be an obituary writer?
The child has not been born who comes home from first grade clutching in his sweaty little fist a composition that says, "When I grow up, I want to be an obituary writer." Who thinks in those terms? But I had been on the Times Book Review copy desk for my first 10 years on the paper, and it was a marvelous job, but I had by this time been to journalism school, been trained to write, had longed for a career as a writer. And because historically, obits are the job that nobody thinks he wants, you and I know different, of course, I was able, by dint of writing many, many advance obituaries over a period of almost the entire decade, I was able to write my way onto a full-time job on obits.
Now, you said you were concerned about your own obituary and what it might say.
When I was a copy editor, the Book Review in those years was a marvelous place full of lively colleagues, surrounded by books. It was like living in the library of one's dreams. But for me, the work of copy editing didn't quite get it done in terms of the sustained level of stimulation that I craved. And so I began to think in an admittedly rather self-pitying way, the only thing they're going to have to put in my epitaph is she changed 50,000 commas into semicolons. And it was then that I started writing advance obits.
Obituaries, of course, are stories not about death, but about lives. They are mini biographies. What's the difference between that and writing long form as a book?
Remarkably little difference. One of my favorite takes on what an obit writer does was given to me by one of my sisters, who is a poet, and she loves to enter these flash fiction contests where you have to write a whole novel in 100 words. I think she's nuts, but she enjoys it. And One day, some years ago, she called me up in the newsroom just to say hello. And when I picked up the phone, she said, "So, how's the flash biography business coming?" I thought it took a poet to make me understand what it is I do. And nonfiction books of the kind I seem to gravitate to writing, which are in large part biographical stories, are just 1,000-word daily obit gridded up 100 times. So the whole structure is there in microcosm in any of the obits that we do each day.
And just the good news for people, if you ever get called about having an advance obit about yourself, Margalit wrote one in 1995 about someone. That obituary still hasn't run. Thanks to Margalit Fox for joining us. Conan Doyle for The Defense, the true story of a sensational British murder, a quest for justice, and the world's most famous detective writer. Just been published by Random House, reviewed in last week's Sunday Times Book Review. Coming up next, editorial board member Vikas Bajaj. Welcome back. Joining me now, editorial board member Vikas Bajaj. He focuses his attention and ours on economics, business, transportation, all intrinsically linked and vital to the thriving of the country, no matter the politics. This past week, it was transportation and the taxi industry. Mass transit not getting much better, despite the governor's promise of a year ago. Now the city council considering a cap on for-hire vehicles like Lyft and Uber. Is that going to make a difference?
I don't think so, Sam. I think this is sort of a distraction. What's going to make a difference in the streets of New York is congestion pricing, which is unfortunately stuck in Albany. And some sort of a minimum wage for the drivers who work for Uber and Lyft, because currently a lot of them are spending 40% of their time idling, waiting for passengers. And if you could force the companies to pay the drivers something for that, they would be forced to be more efficient than they are today.
What about any other moves they could make for Uber and Lyft drivers, and also for taxi drivers, who we've seen, as you pointed out in that editorial, we've had 6 or so people committing suicide.
Right.
And these guys bought, or people who own the medallions paid a fortune for them.
Right.
And those medallions have gone down in price because of an action the city has taken or not taken.
Yeah, it's professional drivers in all classes who are suffering. It's not just the taxi drivers, it's also drivers who work for the liveries, it's drivers who work for black cars. The guy who killed himself in front of City Hall, for instance, he wasn't a taxi driver, he worked for one of the black car companies. So it's a problem across the board. Part of it is that there are just too many drivers trying to compete for a limited number of fares, and then the demand for taxi and Uber is going up, but it's not going up commensurate with the number of drivers that have come into the profession. So part of what you need to do is, if you did a minimum wage on for-hire vehicles, that will force those companies to reduce their ranks, because they won't be able to pay everybody $17.22 an hour.
It would also raise the fares.
It would probably raise the fares, which might not be so great if you are a frequent user of these services, but the studies that I've seen on this is, it wouldn't necessarily make these services unaffordable, especially, in the outer boroughs, in the places where you don't have transit, people will still be able to use the services. It's really, the problem is in Manhattan and the Midtown core, where you have too many cars driving around without passengers, and that's where you'd really need to tackle the congestion.
And as you point out, the average traffic speed south of 60th Street has dropped 22% in the past 7 years alone. What about taxi fares themselves, meter taxis? You say they should be raised too.
Yeah.
How do our fares compare with other cities?
Our fares are, roughly in line with other cities, but New York is a much more dense place, and it's a much higher cost of living. So now our Uber and Lyft and taxi fares tend to be higher than in cities where there isn't as much use of taxis, like say in Los Angeles or in Dallas. But compared to fares in big cities like London, where you have a lot of taxi use, they're not that far off. But we could certainly consider raising the fare for the taxis in Manhattan, because the last time the fares were raised was in 2012, and so it's been a while. You could also do it more creatively. You could say, like, the fare should be higher in the middle of the day. The fare should be higher during rush hour. You could do all sorts of things that would both earn the drivers more money and also discourage people from taking taxis. And then you'd invest at least some of the money, theoretically, that you raised from congestion pricing, or all of it, into the transit, and you'd get more people going back to the subway.
I was in London a couple of months ago, and with congestion pricing, they're obviously raising money, but there was an awful lot of traffic. Do we think congestion pricing will really reduce traffic too?
Yeah, I mean, London is kind of a complicated story. They raised a congestion, they put in a congestion charge, traffic went down, then they made other changes to reduce the use of roads by cars, and so that made traffic become worse. And so it's not so easy to say, oh, it hasn't completely worked in London because there's still traffic in London. There'll always be traffic in London. And part of the problem is the way they design their congestion charges, you pay when you come in. Now, with taxis, you have to do something different, because a taxi will come into the zone at one point and it'll just keep driving around all day. So you don't want to just charge them when they come in. You want to charge on a per trip basis or a per minute basis how much time they spend in that zone. And so if it was well designed, I think most economists and most transportation experts would say it would have an impact.
Great. Vikas Bajaj, editorial board member of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. More Times colleagues join me in a moment for the backstory. Welcome back. Another extraordinary week. Revelations, accusations. Joining me to try to unjumble them, my Times colleagues, contributing writers Eleanor Randolph and Clyde Haberman. We saw ridership on the city subways and buses going down, apparently in part the result of ridership going up on for-hire car services. What does this mean, and why have we still not gotten the mayor and governor together to fix mass transit?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that ridership has gone down because if you have stood on one of those platforms for an extra hour, you start thinking about alternative ways to get to work. I mean, it's the morning commute is such a mess. And it still is. So people, your boss is not going to say, oh no, the MTA again. You're going to have to find some other way to get to work. And the other thing is, first of all, and Clyde and I differ on this slightly, so this will be fun. The governor is in charge of the MTA. He appoints the head of the MTA, he puts the money in the MTA, he has a majority of the MTA board, he says yay or nay on the capital budget. So he really is the main force. But the city is supposed to contribute. And de Blasio and Cuomo are just, two cats in a bag. They cannot figure out how to make it better for the poor old commuter in New York City.
Well, I absolutely agree. I mean, it is.
Oh, whoa.
What? How can that be? No, I mean, it is. I think the nuance differences are between Ella and me on this deal with the mayor's responsibility and whether the city should cough up more. Of course, ultimately it falls on the governor, and the MTA is a state agency. No matter how many times they keep trying to pull out some obscure document showing that the city owns it all, it doesn't mean anything. It is quite shocking. Remember last year, at this time, we had the Summer of Hell, which wasn't really all that hellish in terms of the Penn Station renovations, but there is indeed no visible improvement. I ride principally the number 1 train, and it is astounding the number of cars on that line in particular. I think it's the worst in this regard in the system that don't have air conditioning. Mm-hmm. And obviously, as our summers keep getting hotter, this is this is not just a luxury that I'm lamenting. It's a serious problem.
Let me ask you both two questions. Is there any formula, is there any law, rule, regulation that says how much the city is supposed to contribute?
I don't
No,
think so.
no, there isn't. And Giuliani started scaling back the amount of money that went from the city to the MTA. And so, you know, Bloomberg followed that, and de Blasio kind of tried to follow that for a while, and then finally he did fork over a little bit more money for the for the MTA. So
And Pataki, when he was governor, took money away that should have gone to it. So this is
Cuomo,
a cascading,
too.
deficit, if you will.
They borrowed from maintenance forever. And, you know, it finally catches up with you.
And where should the money come from? One of the things we lost, thanks to Shelley Silver, was the commuter tax. Should we try to impose that again? Where should this money come from? When we're talking really in terms of capital money, construction money, billions of dollars.
We absolutely should impose it again, and the
If we
Times
could.
wrote, editorialized in favor of that about a year ago. But yeah, if we could, it's not going to happen. So it's just a non-starter. Where there should be, and it won't happen under this administration for sure, is more federal money. New York, I forget the exact percentages now, New York City subways account for an extraordinary percentage of overall mass transit users nationwide. This is the only industrial country that I know of that the national government claims to have no role in supporting mass transit.
You know, the other way. I mean, de Blasio keeps talking about this millionaire's tax. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe it would, but I don't think so. But I think the place that they're really going to look is this congestion pricing, which is a way to charge people to come into to central Manhattan, and maybe even charge on what I call the free bridges on the East River.
Mm-hmm. And that seems like it is very quietly going to progress after the state elections.
That's right.
Probably.
Well, there's some hope. I mean, you know, obviously, if you're in Queens or parts of Brooklyn, you do not want to pay extra by going over those bridges, but
And
there are
you
ways.
especially don't want to pay when the alternative is going on a mass transit system that isn't working.
Yeah.
But I've
if it goes
detect-
to the mass
yeah.
transit system, that would help.
Yeah, but I've detected a softening of the opposition on the part of Queens and Brooklyn and Long Island legislators. We'll see. A big question would be, assuming he wins re-election, does Governor Cuomo really push for this in earnest, or does he revert back to, frankly, where he's been on a lot of it, of speaking up on it and then not pushing very aggressively?
It's his now.
Well, he's claiming it. Let's see. Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, Clyde Haberman for joining us, and I'll have some additional thoughts on CODA. According to a Chinese proverb, a man getting drunk at a farewell party should strike a musical tone to strengthen his spirit. And a drunk military man should order gallons and put out more flags to increase his military splendor. We're not suggesting that Governor Cuomo is drunk with power, but he has been putting out more flags. In a visible manifestation of his ongoing and destructive feud with Mayor de Blasio, the governor has been painting our town blue and gold, supposedly the state's colors, to remind voters that Albany subsidizes a lot of what the city spends. Most New Yorkers don't realize that, and it's the state's fault. The capital was transplanted from New York City to Albany in 1797 to shield lawmakers from downstate dominance. It did. In the bargain, they got to operate with little scrutiny 150 miles away. But that also meant they'd receive little credit when they did anything good. Washington wages war. City Hall raises taxes. How many people know what happens in Albany? Governor Cuomo decided to polish the state's image. Uninvited, he deployed scores of state troopers in the city. He parked hulking state dump trucks and state police cars near the bridges and tunnels. He's branding subway cars and buses and even lane markers and tunnel tiles blue and gold. And why not? Cuomo said. Unlike his predecessors, he hasn't placed his name on most state signs. And, after all, the governor argues validly, quote, New York City is part of something called the state of New York. Dark blue, the state's branding book explains, evokes, quote, the value of being authentic. Gold, the value of being inspiring. Cuomo's color scheme raises two questions, though. First, are blue and gold really the state's official colors? We've got an official fossil, insect, muffin, snack, beverage, reptile, and 10 other official symbols, but apparently no official colors. They're not even included in the state's official coloring book. The state flag used to be buff. In 1901, it was changed to blue, not dark blue, but officially azure, which is brighter and more like cerulean. The gold might come from the robe cloaking the figure of justice, but the official specifications from 1778 don't seem to dictate a color. Apart from authenticity, there's the danger that this scheme will reveal the governor's true colors and leave him, well, red-faced. Steve Heller of the School of Visual Arts was quoted as saying, if you take into account Cuomo's ongoing feud with de Blasio, which could be ego, could be ideology, could be any number of things, this is kind of a slap in the face to a mayor. There's a greater political risk to Cuomo. By identifying mass transit and even public safety so clearly as state responsibilities, the governor is leaving himself open not only to take the credit, but also the blame. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.